I have only got 10 minutes with y'all today, which is not a lot of time, but that's totally appropriate because that's the theme of today's talk today. We don't have enough time, or we don't think we have enough time for accessibility. So permit me the next 9 minutes and about 45 seconds to talk through why we don't think we have time for accessibility, how we can demonstrate the benefit of making that time in a very tangible way in the V1 of any early stage product, and where we can start to do the work, where we can do more with less around accessibility. So let's get right into it. Why don't we think we have time for accessibility? If we think about accessibility in a vacuum in the context of our web engineering startup, it seems like something we absolutely want. It's the idea that anyone, regardless of ability or technology, can use our product. Exactly what we need. The problem is that we want a lot of things in an early stage startup. I might have made up some of those. We want a lot of things in an early stage startup, and we have very little of pretty much everything else: people, funding, and time. So we have to prioritize really, really aggressively for the concrete things that drive the business in our MVP. And this is where accessibility loses the battle pretty quickly, because the benefit of accessibility can be a little squishy. Here's what I mean by squishy. Your standard analytics tools, your Google Analytics or whatever, you'll be able to break down your different markets into browser and attribution source and get all these cool metrics around it. You can't do the same for disability or assistive technology. And honestly, you probably don't, subject of a separate talk, but in any case, your traditional product analytic tools aren't going to be able to build a case for accessibility and its impact on your market, which means we lose that prioritization fight, and we quickly find ourselves in V2. V2, the place where we put everything we never intend to actually build. V2 becomes V3, becomes V4, becomes very unlikely that we're ever actually going to build accessibility. So we need to get it into V1. And how do we do that? How do we demonstrate this concrete impact on our target market? And how do we do what Google Analytics cannot? In an ideal world, I like to come into companies and build empathy around accessibility, share user stories. We don't got time for that today, so I'm going to take a different tactic. And I'm going to intentionally use a pretty bad metaphor to bring it back to the concrete impact of accessibility in a more tangible sense. So let's forget about accessibility for a moment. Let's talk about browsers. Browser market share, super tangible metric. Supporting every single browser to a T takes a lot of time. And so we're going to say in our MVP, we're only really going to spend a lot of time testing in one or two major browsers. Let's say we'll do our top two, so Chrome and Safari. Sounds great. For folks who are still using IE, which is for some reason still on this graph, we salute you. We aren't going to be able to support you in V1. And so with this market share, we get about 80% of the total web market if we say we're going to start in just these two browsers. Sounds great. So let's bring accessibility back into the mix. And here's where we have the bad metaphor. Let's pretend accessibility is a browser. Cool? This is the disability accessibility assistive technology browser. I'm going to put it on our graph. And we're going to size it at 25%. The math does not math here. Don't worry about it. It's fine. 25% coming from the 2019 CDC stat that 1 in 4 Americans has some form of disability. So there's our market share. And if this were the way math worked, then we would still not be worried about accessibility because we're falling under that line. We've still got 80% of our market. But like I said, this is not how math works. This is how the math works. That 25% of individuals is interspersed within the rest of this browser market share across the board. So now we maybe aren't talking about 80%, we're maybe talking about 55%. We've suddenly introduced a 25% margin of error into our target market calculations by not thinking about accessibility or saying we aren't sure if we're going to want to support it. Instead of thinking it's a variable, we can sort of put to the wayside the mu for anyone who's an economist. No one? That's fine. But it's actually part of our initial equation that we need to solve for in V1. V2 is going to be too late. So we need to build accessibility now. How do we do that? It's in scope, but where do we actually find time to do that work? We're bought in, but we're in the middle of a project. We've got deadlines. Where does it happen? And this is where you pull up your Gantt and you say, Plum, there's not going to be enough time for accessibility in there. We aren't really going to fit it in V1. You know, I've never, like SEO, I've never heard in V2. Anyway. And you know what? I completely agree with you. If you are in the 11th hour of a major build and you're trying to Tetris in a full accessibility initiative, It's not going to fit. Not because accessibility is inherently time-consuming. It's because you've already done all this work that now needs to be reevaluated under a different lens, and that takes time, which again, we don't have. The key to fitting accessibility into your project is to structure it a little more like this, to do the accessibility work along with the work that's already being done. Accessibility success criteria in their full scope can be incredibly complicated. It takes a lot of expertise to build a fully compliant application, but we don't need to build a fully compliant application right out of the gate. We just need to do the best that we can to capture as much of that market as possible, and moving back to empathy, to really serve folks as best as possible with what we're trying to do. The basic accessibility considerations are things that you can already do in the scope of work that's already being done with very, very little time investment. Let's talk about a couple ways that that happens, or as I like to call it, accessibility in 3D, no special glasses needed, for definition, design, and development, to see where this low-cost accessibility can happen. First, in your definition phase, if you're still really early on in your product lifecycle, this is great because that means you have the time right now to set the expectation around accessibility that flows through the rest of your development lifecycle. You don't want to write user stories specifically for every disability. That's not the way to go about it. Instead, you want to write user stories and requirements that focus on application function versus any specific individual user and how they might experience the world. Accessible user stories actually have a really great example in the wild in accessibility success criteria themselves. If you look at standards such as WCAG 2.1, now 2.2 as of a couple weeks ago, then you know that those stories are written to focus on the application outcomes rather than user abilities. You can write the same amount of user stories in the same amount of time, but define a more usable product that hits a wider market by building accessibility into those criteria. Next, into design. Many design tools, including our favorite Figma and others, have plugins that will check for basic visual accessibility errors, such as color contrast. For those not familiar, color contrast is the mathematical difference between the foreground color and the background color to determine if it has sufficient contrast for someone to be able to see it. This is something, it's basic math, something computers have done for years, very easy to do, and yet, in a survey of 2023, this year, top 1 million homepages in the United States, 83.6% still had color contrast errors. So get ahead of 83.6% of the market by taking this basic consideration when you're starting to do your design. And finally, it wouldn't be LeadDev without development. And if we're already mid-build, this is a really bad time to ask, but did we pick an accessible JavaScript framework? The answer is no. The answer is also yes. The real answer is it really isn't about the framework. It's all about how you use it. At the end of the day, every single front-end framework on the web is going to bring us back to good old semantic HTML. These are elements with specific functions that have been built into browsers for literal decades. And assistive technologies know how to use these elements as well. So if you're using these elements for their default functionality, you're all set. You don't need to do anything else to teach assistive technology how to use your site. If you're spending a lot of time to build a really cool new interactive way to break the mold of user experience, you're probably actually spending a lot of time to make a less accessible application. So save yourself the time there. And finally, the ultimate time saver. We've heard a little bit about AI in a couple of our other presentations today. What if you don't want to write any code? As it turns out, while ChatGPT may not be able to build a fully accessible application end-to-end with no user input, I will say in a basic test of things like form fields, other basic menus, ChatGPT did a pretty good job of spitting out accessible HTML without having to specify that it needed to be accessible. So there's another benefit for you right there. Coming back to our final timeline, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where you are in your MVP. We've already seen in just a few minutes how many quick tricks that you can build into different parts of your process to be able to build more accessible work with way less time investment and major user usability and market addressable benefits. We know why accessibility might seem like it's a V2 item, but we also know how to reframe it to be beneficial in V1 and where we can start to do the work. You have time for accessibility, and I am out of time for today. Thank you. Thank you, friends.